Happy Halloween everyone! This is the first one for the channel, so I want to say a quick thanks to everyone for all the support over the last few months, and I hope you're ready for a spooky time. As always, I love reading your comments, and I hope you like this video, and if you think you know anyone who would like it, maybe share it with them. Anyway, thanks again, and I hope you like the video. Alan Wake is a game that has always stood out in my memory. I first played it when I was pretty young, and back then it was scary enough that I didn't actually finish it. Despite that though, Alan Wake isn't a horror game really. It's more action-adventure with some occasional scares along the way. But since it's the game's 10th anniversary, I decided we should take a look into it and enjoy all its B-movie charm for our Halloween special. This video is going to be a bit different than usual, because it's Halloween, and because there's a lot of things to talk about in the game's background, influences, and legacy. And since this is the 10th video, I felt the need to go all out for it. But I'll get as much non-spoiler stuff out of the way first, before I ruin anything, in case any of you want to actually play the game first. So I'm going to give you the basic gist of the game's plot and gameplay, and then give you a quick spoiler warning before talking about the bulk of the story, mixed in with some of my favourite parts of the game, and general tangents like I always have in these videos. When I played Alan Wake before, I didn't really know anything about the game or Remedy as a developer before going in, so I definitely didn't pick up on most of the references that were being made. And to be honest, even now, there's so many in here that I wouldn't be surprised if I missed as many as I pick up on. But we'll start with a little overview of the game's development, just to give you some context. So Alan Wake is the 4th game from Remedy, and it's their first game after Max Payne 1 and 2. And this game took them a while to make. Like it was 7 years between Max Payne 2 and Alan Wake, and this delay wasn't something that was planned. The game was originally announced at E3 2005, and they partnered with Microsoft in 2006. But it still wasn't until 2010 that the game was released. Sam Lake, the creative director of Alan Wake, has said in interviews that the game took a while to come together as a concept, and on top of that, there was a time when this was going to be an open world game with a day-night cycle, and this was partially developed before it ended up being shipped as the more linear title we see now. The whole project was originally an Xbox 360 exclusive, though it did get a PC port 2 years later that came with all the DLC, and it's a really solid port, so this is the version I'm playing. So this basic premise will only spoil around the gist of the first 30 minutes of the game and the basic gameplay, so you should be safe if you want to play the game. Alan Wake is a best-selling author who's been struggling to write a new book after his last novel, where he killed off the grizzled New York detective protagonist and decided to move on to new pastures. The game starts as Alan has a nightmare about one of his characters trying to kill him as he makes his way towards a lighthouse. And once he gets inside, he wakes up and is on a boat to the small town of Bright Springs. Trying to get away from the stress of his writing, Alan goes on a holiday with his wife to the town. And skipping some plot that I'll loop back around to, during the night people can be possessed by a dark presence and they want to kill Alan. So, armed with a flashlight and a pistol, he has to overpower the darkness before killing the Taken. There is some skill in juggling which Taken you focus your light on, as well as watching your batteries don't run out, though they do recharge with time and you can swap batteries if you can't wait for that recharge. In an interesting tie-in, the batteries in this game are all energizers, and I can only assume they're hoping we were all using those wireless, battery-powered Xbox controllers and would decide to stock up on energizers after playing this. Over the game, you can find bigger flashlights and lamps which are stronger and last longer, as well as finding shotguns, rifles, flare guns, flares, flashbangs to fight the Taken and other enemies. The weapon variety is actually pretty good, and while there can be sections where you don't have abundant amounts of ammo, the game isn't harsh about it on normal difficulty. And in general, combat does a decent job of ramping difficulty up as the game goes along. Now, since this is a heavily plot-based game, I'm eager to get into spoiler territory so I can start being specific about parts I love and why I like them so much. But for any of you on the fence about playing the game, I'm just going to give you a quick final point so you can decide if you want to play this game before spoilers. This game isn't very scary, and it's probably a 7 out of 10 on gameplay alone. But it is a story-driven game that plays around with a few fun mechanics to keep things interesting, and you're usually on pretty short tracks between scripted events or story points, so you've always got a pretty concise objective. There's light puzzle elements and some larger set pieces, and all in all, it's a pretty good plot to keep you going for around 10 to 15 hours. And to nail down the tone of this game, because I keep saying it's not spooky but kind of is, it actually opens on a quote from Stephen King, which essentially sets up the entire style of the game.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end.
This game doesn't need to make sense, and you should just enjoy the plot for what it is. The game actually spends a lot of time bouncing around this core idea, sometimes trying to be silly and sometimes trying to be scary, but in my opinion it's almost always been enjoyable. So if you want a last minute Halloween game, I'd say check it out. From now on, I'm going to essentially spoil the entire game, more or less in chronological order, though with some tangents as they make sense. Okay, so if you're sticking around for the spoilers, I hope they're worth it, and thanks again for watching. I'm going to try and be as thorough on the description as possible, but try not to make it look like I'm just reading a plot synopsis, so it'll be broken up a bit here and there. This game is split into 6 episodes, though this wasn't an episodic game in the Telltale sense. All 6 episodes released together on the same disc. Some of these episodes are way more story heavy than others, so I'll be focusing on those more than the combat ones. So as I said already, Alan and his wife Alice are heading to Bright Springs to get away from the city and relax. And once they get there, they have to stop in the local diner to pick up their cabin keys from a man called Stucky. While Alice goes to fill up the car, Alan heads inside and is instantly recognized by the waitress, ruining his chance of getting a quiet getaway from his writing. This diner actually lets us meet a few of the characters who come up during the plot, so I guess I'll introduce them here. So first up we have the Anderson brothers, 2 old metalheads who get you to put on the jukebox for the Coconut song. Then we have Cynthia Weaver, who warns you not to go into the dark while clutching onto a lamp. Remedy have admitted she was inspired by the log lady from Twin Peaks, but a lot of the characters in this game are inspired by other media, so that's not really shocking. Then we have a park ranger who shows up in a pretty minor capacity later, and as I mentioned already, Rose, who is one of the more important characters. Now, Alan is a very grumpy bastard and doesn't want to talk to all the people, so heads straight to the bathroom in the back to find Stucky. Instead, however, a woman stops him and gives him the keys and directions to the cabin. So Alan and Alice head off in their car just as Stucky comes out of the diner trying to run after them because they never pick up their keys. So you can see already this game isn't trying to be 100% serious and is leaning into the much more spooky side of things. Anyway, cut to the cabin on the lake. Alice is afraid of the dark and makes Alan turn on a generator before she goes inside the cabin. And then she says she has a gift for him. In an attempt to help Alan start writing again, Alice gives him the gift of a typewriter and wants him to meet with a local psychologist who specializes in helping struggling artists. Alan storms outside into the dark so she won't follow him, and then he hears her scream. And when he comes back in, it seems like she was torn out of the house into the lake, so he dives into the water after her, and then wakes up just as he crashes a car into a forest at night. In the forest, Alan finds a sheet of paper, which turns out to be the title page of a novel with his name on the front of it, as well as another page describing a shadowed man preparing to attack the narrator. These pages in general are a minor but very interesting part of the game. Apart from a handful of plot-relevant sheets, all the other pages in the game are just collectibles, but it very quickly becomes apparent that the pages predict what is going to happen to Alan and the people around him. So there's tons of examples here, and most of the important scenes in the game are actually available as collectibles. So there were times that plot points would get spoiled 30 minutes before I got to them, which is a fascinating way to pace your game. As well as this, some of the pages are good for giving you background about what happens to important characters when they're off screen, such as one describing Alice inside the darkness, or another talking about the Anderson brothers in the 70s. I'll mention more of these as they come up, but they're a nice treat to find as you play the game, and they're fully narrated, which I love. Moving through the forest, Alan is dealing with a concussion and not knowing where his wife is when he comes across Stucky, who has been taken by the darkness. Now, a weird part about the tone here is how these named taken characters say stuff relating to their normal lives, but in weird pitch-shifted ways, which I think isn't meant to be scary.
Fair and squirrel!
This occurs with basically any important boss taken, and it's kind of funny for how silly the lines they say are. Anyway, after a reference to The Shining, Alan finds a gun and a flashlight, and starts fighting his way to a petrol station to try and get some help. Now, in between monologues and shooting taken, Alan Wake has a weird emphasis on collectibles. These range for collecting for fun, such as a 100 coffee thermos scattered all around the place, as well as the pages of the books I mentioned earlier, with some of those only show up on Nightmare difficulty. On top of those, you have radios you can find to get a minute or two of lore followed by a song, then finally you have the Night Springs TV show. I'll talk about Night Springs when we get to my favourite one later on, but for now I'll give you a little bit of info about the radio show. On the boat into town at the very beginning of the game, Alan met the host of one of the local radio shows. And then throughout the game, you can find radios and listen to him talk for a bit. And sometimes he's talking about simple things about how he likes the air around the town. But as the game goes on, some of them touch on the oddities around the town, or the oppressive atmosphere that can come over the locality.
I just stepped outside to catch a breath of fresh air. Let me tell you, the weather's getting heavy. Nights like this make me especially glad I'm here talking to you and not home in bed. Once the weather takes a turn like this, I can't sleep at all. It's all tangled bed sheets and dark thoughts, punctuated by the occasional plunge into nightmare. Is it just me? Well, perhaps it is.
All of these broadcasts end with a different song playing in its entirety. And I thought this was an interesting thing to do, because while I don't know how much licensing music for a game like this costs, I know it costs something. And for the devs to be so committed to have music play at the end of radio broadcasts and at the end of episodes is really cool, and some of these songs are the kind of thing I'm into, so it was a surprising way to find new music. Back to the plot though. Before you reach the station, you end up having to kill Stucky as well as a bunch of taken. And as you finally move into the station, you can see it's been trashed, and come across a TV that shows Alan writing and talking to himself while in the cabin. You call the sheriff, and when she arrives, she tells Alan that there hasn't been a cabin on the lake for more than 40 years, which is the kind of stereotypical spooky ending I expected to episode 1. I think episode 1 does a good job overall of introducing you to the core elements of the game, but the later episodes are much better because they're able to improve and develop on those ideas. So since the game is split into episodes, every new episode starts with a recap of the previous one, which is kind of fun because of how melodramatic they are. The voice actor for Alan Wake does a lot of good work in this game, which I think is a large part of what carries the game as a whole experience. Anyway, episode 2 starts with a flashback in Alan's New York apartment. Here we learn that Alan essentially wrote Max Payne. Like, it was a grizzled New York detective whose wife and daughter were killed, and the notes here are actually voiced by Max Payne's voice actor, who also features in the game later on as one of the major characters, Thomas Zane.
I'd lain here in the snow while the lurid chain of scenes that had led me here kept playing in my head. A rerun of my own private snuff movie. A memory of my corpse. Alone at my own wake. Thinking in metaphors again.
So after episode 1 only gave us questions, episode 2 decides to just add to them. Alan is taken to the sheriff's station and checked over, where he learns that he lost an entire week between when Alice went missing and when he woke up. While he's talking to the sheriff though, he gets a phone call telling him his wife has been kidnapped and he better go to Lover's Peak that night alone if he ever wants to see her again. It's at this point that Alan's agent Barry shows up after not being able to reach Alan for a week, and the psychiatrist that his wife wanted to see also comes to offer his services. Alan ends up punching the psychiatrist and Barry drives Alan to Lover's Peak. These daytime sections are interesting in that there's never any enemies around during daytime, so it's just walking around, looking for collectibles, and listening to NPCs talking. These are pretty nice because they never outside their welcome and help pace things after the isolation and action of the nighttime sections. Alan tells Barry what's going on, and while he thinks he's crazy, he agrees to go along with things because you two have known each other for so long, and he lets you go to Lover's Peak to meet the kidnapper that night anyway. After a long hike through the woods that sees the darkness kill the local ranger from earlier, you meet the kidnapper. He demands all the pages for your book, and after a brief fight, he leaves and says to meet him in an abandoned mine in 2 days' time with all the pages. You head back over to Barry, who's been trapped in his cabin as flocks of birds surround it. After you kill all the birds, Barry heads out to try and find more pages, but gets a call from Rose from the diner saying she's found them all. At the end of the call though, we see that the darkness is controlling Rose, taking us to the end of episode 2. I should point out now that it was actually Microsoft's influence that stopped the game being a true episodic release, and I think I'm kind of happy about that, because these first 2 episodes are very focused on raising questions and don't really kick the game overall into gear. I did enjoy these episodes and it wasn't like it was a pain to get through, but I think things continue to improve as the episodes go on. Episode 3 begins with Alan and Barry at the trailer park where Rose lives being led to her trailer by the park owner. There's an entire boat in the middle of the place which is thrown there in the middle of the night before by the darkness, but the owner only treats it as a passing inconvenience. After meeting with Rose, she makes Alan and Barry a coffee laced with sedatives which knocks them out, and when they come to, it's nighttime again. And since it was nighttime, I was expecting the game would start throwing monsters at you, but it didn't. Instead, you actually find a manuscript page telling you that the park owner called the police because he didn't like the look of Alan and Barry. So as you step outside, you notice flashing lights in the distance, and once you get back to the entrance, you get to meet Agent Nightingale, who very quickly establishes his entire character as a loose cannon by shooting at Alan, who tries to run off into the woods. You then get a nice section here with Alan running unarmed off into the forest trying to escape the police while both Alan and the police are having to deal with the darkness. A very smart storytelling point here is how one or two police cars are thrown by the darkness in Alan's path, and each one of them lets you listen into the police comms so you know what they're trying to deal with as well. You trek your way through the hills towards the radio station, trying to get directions to the mine from the local radio host. And when you finally get to the radio station, Agent Nightingale shows up, having heard the presenter mention seeing you. Anyway, he does the loose cannon shooting again, you run away again, down towards the train depot, and eventually steal a car, bringing us to the first large open section of the game. Driving in this game comes up a bit in these later episodes, and it's interesting how many different cars that are modeled in the game. These are actually part of a sponsored tie-in with Fords and Lincoln, like the Energizer batteries from earlier, and driving as well as the number of cars are definitely a result of the game's earlier ambition to be an open world game. When I started this episode, the cutscene starts you beside your car looking over a valley, and I kind of assumed I just had to run down the hill, before realising I was meant to drive to the mine to meet the kidnapper. Now, the physics for cars are kind of floaty, but I enjoyed this in an arcade racing kind of way. So it's very easy to make the back of your car spin out when you go into a corner, and crashing the car doesn't have huge consequences unless you flip it. But any driving sections tend to have lots of replacement cars around to make it pretty inconsequential. Adding on to how big the driving areas are, there's usually a few collectibles hidden in houses or barns on the path you're meant to be going on, so I appreciate the game rewarding me for poking around. After drifting down to the mine and reading a bit about the history of the place, Alan goes inside to meet the kidnapper, and this is probably one of the more awkward transitions between gameplay and cutscenes, because you're walking up the stairs, looking at the big rail yard and far off mountain, and you start to push the door open and then suddenly
the cutscene starts. And the resolution and lighting have completely changed, adding in cinematic bars and just jarring things a bit. And I mean, I know lots of games do this, so I'm not mad. If anything, I found it pretty funny. But I feel the need to point it out since I did laugh when it happened. Anyway, in the cutscene, Alan waits for a good few hours only for the kidnapper to not even show up.
Back in the game though, he calls instantly and says to meet him up at Mirror Peak, so you have to fight your way across the train yard, into a forest and up onto a hillside. And in some of the earlier episodes you've kind of seen these settings already, but despite all taking place at night and often in forests, Alan Wake does a decent job of making it feel like you're going to big effort and exploring the whole area around Bright Falls as you try and find your wife. You eventually make it towards Mirror Peak and hear the kidnapper admit that he never had your wife and never knew where she was, just as a giant tornado takes him off into the night. But before it can do the same to Alan, he lights a flare which makes the tornado drop him into the lake below. I should note that every episode loves ending on new notes of melodrama, and this really doesn't slow down from here. And while I didn't talk about much of the content of this episode because it's nothing hugely new for the review, I should note that this episode was one of my favourites in the game because of how well crafted and thought out it felt, as well as hitting the right levels between exploring, melodrama, and light scares. Episode 4 starts things off on an interesting note, and is probably the longest continuous dialogue stretch in the game. Alan wakes up in a lodge operated by the psychologist he punched back in episode 2, Dr. Hartman, who tells him that he's been making everything up in his mind, and that his wife drowned in the lake and there's never been anything supernatural happening. While you're planning how to escape, you and Hartman go on a walk around the lodge overlooking Cauldron Lake, as he tells you how he can help you write again and that you should forget about your wife. During your tour through the lodge, you get to meet some of its inhabitants. These include an artist who's inspired by meeting Alan, a writer who's making a very thin reference to making Max Payne,
there because they think mullets are funny, but it wasn't supposed to be about mullets, and now it's about mullets, and when it's in slow motion, they call it mullet time.
And then finally, you get to see the Anderson brothers that we met in the diner way back at the start of the game. These two aged metalheads allude to the idea that they know about the dark presence and left a hint back at their old farm before they got dementia on how to face it. At this point though, Alan is told he should head back to his room and try and write. But before he heads back, he hears that an unexpected storm might be on the way. Back up in Alan's room, the storm rolls in as the orderly watches Alan writing. But there's an argument downstairs, so he goes to investigate before Alan follows. The Anderson brothers have hit the nurse on the head with a hammer that they dubbed Molnir, giving Alan a chance to steal her keys. You decide to go to Hartman's office to pick up your manuscript, but on the way discover some tapes that show that Hartman was behind the fake kidnapping all along, and was trying to use Alan to make money by making him write more books under supervision and charging him fees for his help. This is the entire point of the lodge operation for all the artists here. As a random tangent, this reminds me of something that actually happened in real life, where Brian Wilson, the creative lead of the Beach Boys around the time of Good Vibrations and Pet Sounds, ended up under the control of a psychiatrist who misdiagnosed Brian and inserted himself into the back-end production of the Beach Boys. Now, I have no idea if this was thought of when they were making this plot, and I kind of doubt it, but this is something I was thinking about when I was playing this section. Anyway, back on track, Alan finds that Barry has been locked up beside Hartman's office, and while Barry goes to get a car for them to escape in, Alan goes into the office to confront Hartman and get his manuscript back. During this confrontation though, the darkness begins to creep into the room, and Alan runs out and locks the door behind him, leaving Hartman to fall to the darkness. Now as Alan tries to escape through the lodge, you get the most in-your-face ad in the entire game. As I mentioned earlier, you have these great Twilight Zone shorts that you can watch on TVs in the game. So when you see a TV, you're actually usually excited to see it. But in the middle of the escape sequence through the lodge, you turn on a TV just to get an ad for Verizon. And I'm not really upset because I know Remedy used money from this ad to put it back into the game, but I just find it so bizarre that they chose this spot in all the game to put the ad. When the escape resumes though, you get out into the lodge's garden, which shows us the entire building for the first time. And it might be a bit of a stretch, but I feel like the basic idea of this lodge is inspired by Stanley Kubrick's version of the hotel from The Shining. It wouldn't be the first time that the game has taken inspiration from The Shining, and as you go out into the hedge maze that the lodge has, I definitely don't think it's a stretch to say that at least the gardens are inspired by the movie. Following on from some close quarters jump scares in the gardens and a fight against a now possessed orderly, Alan and Barry drive off towards the Andersons' farm, only for a falling boulder to cause them to crash their car into a forest, forcing the two to split up and make their own ways down. I like this intro to the section because you get a nice view of the huge fields on the farm and have to make your own way down to it. And this includes a driving section that either lets you go straight to the objective or take a few stops for ammos and collectibles. Down at the farm though, we have the section of the game that has stood out in my mind for the longest time, and it's hard to believe that it only lasts for 4 minutes. The Andersons built a giant stage on their farm back when they were famous metalheads, and for some reason the entire stage is still rigged with pyrotechnics ready to go. And it's here that you and Barry have to try and hold out as waves of taken approach. Luckily, Barry is just about able to manage all the equipment, which sets off a recording of the old gods of Asgard, as well as a lot of fireworks which help you as you fight all the Taken. From talking to some other people who played this game, it's interesting to see that I wasn't the only one that this scene stood out for. In part, this is probably because this is the point in the game that the game stacks things so much in your favour that even though you're facing way more enemies than usual, you can still tear through them, mixed in with the flashiness of the setting overall. This scene is probably why this video got made, and even on replaying it, I really enjoyed it. After this, you and Barry push through towards the brother's house, trying to find whatever hint is in there. Along the way, we catch another episode of Night Springs, and Barry mentions that Alan actually wrote some earlier episodes of the show, which I thought was a nice throwaway line. Skipping ahead a little though, and glancing over fighting a combine harvester, you and Barry go into Valhalla and turn the power back on, which starts a record downstairs with another one of the old gods songs, which talks about how the Lady of the Light holds the answer. Alan realizes this is the woman he saw all the way back at the diner at the start of the game. To celebrate surviving all the chaos, Alan and Barry have some of the Andersons' moonshine before falling asleep. Alan then has a dream where he remembers everything that happened in the week he lost. The Dark Presence had convinced him the only way to save his wife was to write an entire novel, but in the novel it made him give more and more power to it. Though Alan was able to escape in time with the help of Thomas Zane, which brings us up to him crashing the car in episode 1. When Alan wakes up, he's faced with Agent Nightingale and gets arrested, ending episode 4. On playing this episode, it feels like the game was able to show off what it wanted to be without any constraints, and for that reason this is probably one of my favourite episodes of the entire game. As a tangent before we go on to episode 5 though, I just want to talk about the music of the game. So, in particular, the Old Gods of Asgard are actually a Finnish band by the name of Poets of the Fall. And they've done work before with Remedy for Max Payne as well as some of their later games, but I find it fascinating because when I tried to look up their music on Spotify to find them, I wasn't able to find the Alan Wake music on the Poets of the Fall page. And it wasn't then until I looked at the Old Gods of Asgard that I found that they actually set up a Spotify page for the fake band to put their music on it, which I think was a really nice touch. Episode 5 starts with Alan and Barry in a cell at the back of the sheriff's office on the night before Deerfest. Agent Nightingale comes in and says he's read Wake's manuscript and it's all the evidence he needs to know that Alan was behind everything. Sheriff Baker decides to trust Wake that the monsters are real and decides that she'll help him. This causes Nightingale to pull his gun on them, though before he can do anything, he remembers that he read this before in one of Alan's pages, and as he goes to read it, the darkness pulls him out of the building. And I love the paradox that this creates, that Nightingale read that he would read this, and that's what reminds him that he should read the page, which just describes him reading the page and remembering that he should read it. Not caring too much about the agent though, Alan and Sarah head out to get the keys to the town helicopter to get Alan to the power plant where the Lady of the Light lives. Sarah tells Barry to call a bunch of the locals who always felt that something might have been going on, so they can help them if anything goes wrong. This segment moving through the town is really nice. The neon lights of some of the businesses, as well as the decorations for the festival, and the fact that this isn't the normal abandoned buildings or forest background, just makes it all feel fresh. As well as that, for a game where you're almost always isolated, to be with a good companion for so long is really nice. Anyway, you move through Bright Falls, collect the keys from the town hall, and make your way through the heart of the festival decorations, down into a church cellar, and out towards the helicopter. You get in the helicopter and head off towards the power plant after a last horde defense section. Now, like basically every game with a helicopter ever, you don't stay in it for long. Near the power plant, birds attack it and Alan falls out, meaning you have to take the rest of the trip alone. There's nothing crazy about this segment, and it's a decently short trip to get to the power plant, though the game is making you face more tough enemies at once, which bumps up the challenge just a little bit. Before we get to the power plant though, let me finally talk about the Night Springs TV show. There's 6 of these in the game, and while I like them all, the one I want to talk about is the one that shows up here. I've always been a fan of the original 1950s and 60s run of The Twilight Zone, and all of these shows here are heavily influenced by its really camp style of science fiction. So in the very last one of the Night Springs episodes, the writers just give up, and we have an old woman showing her friend a mysterious hole in the basement. And as they discuss what it could be, a man appears. He's the writer of the episode, and he basically admits he has no idea where the plot is going and what he's doing. And they try and suggest what he could do, but he just tells him to go back upstairs while he tries to figure it out. The episode ends as he thinks to himself, would it be stupid if he just ended the episode there? All of these episodes are fun and silly, but this one in particular just tries to be meta to end things off, and I love that I had to watch this while a bridge rotating beside me kept crashing into the road, causing the screen to shake. Once you get to the power plant, the Lady of the Light opens the door and you get to see this glorious building where there's no shadows anywhere, and she tells you that Thomas Zane gave her a special weapon. So you two head into a pipe that takes you all the way to the dam where she keeps it. But as you're in the pipe, Alan hears that Sarah and Barry's helicopter has crashed, so he goes out to help them. This gives you one last cliffside walk before you catch up with the two of them, making your way to the dam to be with Cynthia again. Episode 5 ends the way it begins, with another slight paradox, where the clicker that Alan used as a child to help with his fear of the dark was actually something written by Thomas Zane, which seems to imply that Alan was made up, even though he made up Thomas Zane. Basically, the clicker allows Alan to turn night into day this one time, and then he gets in a car and drives off towards the island. Episode 6 is short and focused, and is entirely about Alan ending the fight. This driving section is easily the longest in the entire game, and it takes you quite a distance. There are 1 or 2 sections where you have to get out on foot, and in the first one of these, the world gets turned back into night again by the darkness. But I really did enjoy this final stretch. Along the way, I stopped at a motel, and as I investigated the place, I found Agent Nightingale's room, filled with alcohol everywhere. And as I left, he gave me a jump scare, literally jumping down from the roof, and I finally got to take him out. Anyway, after quite a few combat sections, I kept pushing on towards the island as reality began to break down, and I finally saw the tornado where the island once was. Jumping into it moves Alan into the darkness, and we finally get to see what it looks like inside it. This introduces a strange mechanic where Alan can now write what is happening. So basically, prompts appear in the air, and if you illuminate them, they come to life. Alan uses this to create a path that will bring him to the cabin, where inside he faces the darkness, places the clicker inside her chest, and kills her, beating the game. This gives us a cutscene showing everyone celebrating Deerfest, Alice swimming out of the lake, Rose clutching a lantern like Cynthia would, and Agent Nightingale in the shadows behind her. Alan is trapped in the lodge and is planning to write his escape, with Space Oddity playing as the credits roll. And that is the end of the core game of Alan Wake, which was meant to be Season 1 of the story. We do have 2 DLCs included in the PC version, which are meant to bridge things into the plot for Season 2, so I'm going to run through them quickly. Both of them are pretty short though, and only take around 3 hours combined. So these special episodes make a pretty clever use of existing game assets and kind of remix them into a new dreamlike tone of the darkness. Special 1 begins by putting you in the diner from episode 1 of the base game, except this time when you try to go into the bathroom to meet Stucky, you can actually go inside. And while he's still not there, Thomas Zane talks you through a mirror, tells you that he's going to try and help you, and gives you a flashlight and a gun. Then you have to fight your way out of the diner into the town, except when you kick down the door, you're in a forest and have to make your way to a cabin. The writing prompt effect that was in the last few minutes of the base game are now everywhere throughout these DLCs, and are used in a few interesting ways. I was impressed that devs saved this kind of cool effect until the very end of the game, but it's used very well here. Anyway, as you move through the dream, you go between parts of the town segments that you face with Sarah, but also new buildings are there, and some impossible spaces are added too. On some TVs you see Mr. Scratch, who basically is an evil version of Alan who wants him to give in to the darkness. And just like Alan, he can write within the dream. So basically you'll see him on TV describing how Alan will die just as swarms of enemies spawn. And this is another case of excellent voice acting from Alan, just carrying the game very well. As you move through the town, you eventually get back to the church cellar we saw in episode 5. But this time it's several times larger than it was before, and it's filled with boilers that will explode from the writing prompt. This section is pretty spooky, but you can use flashbangs to set off several boilers at once to take out swarms of the Taken, which I think was a really creative use of the space. Anyway, the rest of this DLC gets a bit meta, with you talking to a dream version of Barry who likes to remind you that he's just a dream and you're really talking to yourself. I like how the devs use the excuse of the darkness to reuse existing assets, but actually capture the idea by allowing you to move from the town to the forest, back to the town, and off to a sawmill, and then through your New York apartment. So even though I didn't love this DLC because I felt it focused too much on combat, I did like the environments you moved through. This DLC ends with a boss fight against several TVs that are controlled by Mr. Scratch, and after you win, you get a cutscene showing Alan back at the lodge with Hartman, though the camera continues to zoom out until it shows Alan is in the dark place, trapped inside his own mind. The second special for me is probably not only the better of the DLCs, but probably one of the best episodes in the entire game, however. It picks up right after the first special and has Alan in the gardens outside the lodge, trying to meet up with the dream version of Barry. As he moves to the lodge, we get a recreation of the concert from the Andertons' farm, though not only is it in the wrong place, but it also has the music play distorted and out of time as Alan faces swarms of enemies. After it finishes, Alan moves through the lodge to meet Thomas Zane, who directs him to create a path over the lake towards the lighthouse from the intro. Even though there's nothing puzzle-like about the path creation, I think the second DLC just takes the ideas laid out from the first special and then uses them in more creative ways that lean into the strengths of the game in storytelling, some light scares, and not too much combat. After some cramped combat in pipes, you enter a big wheel which is meant to show Alan's life, and as it slowly creaks along, you have to move through a few different scenes from the game. This is a small section, but I like how it's used to break up the combat, and I really thought it was a creative thing to do. Anyway, at the end of this wheel, you slip underneath it and find an elevator which takes you into the petrol station from the end of episode 1. You then see the lighthouse closer now, and after some puzzles and combat trying to get closer to it, you end up back in Hartman's office. Here you get a nice long section with Hartman and a version of Alan with a TV for a head, where the two talk about how bad Alan was to his wife before recording plays about how upset she was with all his melodrama. After this talk though, Alan hears Alice's voice saying that she never thought that. And I don't know if this was meant to represent Alan's self-loathing versus the reality of what his wife actually thought, but either way I thought this was the kind of stuff that makes this DLC much better than the first one. Leaving this office brings us into the very last stretch of the DLC. This features the lighthouse from the Nightmare way back at the start of the game, shining light on a long and winding path that features lots of Taken. But they all die instantly as the lighthouse beams come around every other second. I thought this was an excellent way to bring you up to the building, and after you get inside and climb to the top of the tower, you open the hatch and come out back outside the cabin. And as you walk up to it, Mr. Scratch turns everyone against Alan, and you have to face some kind of boss rush against Hartman, then the Anderson brothers, before finally facing Barry. And after you face them, you go into the cabin, go up to the typewriter, and sit down to write your escape from the dark place. A sequel to The Departure, called The Return. So, what about The Return? Well, Alan Wake 2 started development, and there was an Xbox Live arcade game called Alan Wake's American Nightmare, but the full sequel got cancelled, so it looked like there was never going to be a continuation to this world that Remedy had made. But in 2019, they bought the rights to the franchise back from Microsoft, and then confirmed that their title, Control, was set in the same universe as Alan Wake. And then they followed up on this by releasing a crossover DLC for Control that features Alan Wake himself. I won't be covering this DLC in this video because I'll cover it whenever I eventually get around to Control, but there is hope for the franchise yet. And there's 2 points I'd like to make here. Firstly, this game has a pretty big emphasis on lighting effects, so I'd love to see it remastered since lighting has come a long way in the last decade, and I'd love to see the moonbeams and flashlight effects in this forest setting. Now, I think it's unlikely that this will happen because Remedy is currently working on 2 games to be published by Epic Games, but also the graphics for Alan Wake hold up pretty well and the game wasn't a huge seller, so the likelihood of remake or remaster are very slim. Secondly though, because the graphics do kind of hold up, I would actually recommend checking out this game. It was taken off stores a few years back because of licensing issues to do with the sheer amount of songs used in the game, but Remedy and Microsoft were able to get it back, so it's on Steam now for $12.50, which I think is a good price, and it does go on sale lower, so if you're hesitant, you can get it for a few euro easily. I'd recommend picking it up for around 15 hours or so of content. I played this over around 3 weeks, and I enjoyed every minute I spent with the game.
After the completion of any difficult undertaking, there are mixed emotions.
This video took me a long time to make, and was kind of rushed to get out in time for Halloween, so sorry that the quality dipped in some places. I kinda ran out of time to make this. But I hope you really enjoyed it, and if you've made it to this point in the video, you've watched a lot of my content to get here. So I want to say a huge thank you for watching all of this. And yeah, you've probably already liked and subscribed if you made it to this point, but I'd love to hear your opinions on games I should cover in the future, what you think of Alan Wake if you played it, or if you'd be interested in trying it out, as well as that, what you're playing for Halloween in general. And until next time, thanks very much. If you want to keep up with me, you should check out my Twitter, and I'll see you in the next one.